Welcome back to another PFF podcast. I'm Mike Renner, joined by Sam Monson, and Steve's off again. We don't know where he is. I actually texted him yesterday to find out where he was. Still hasn't texted me back. Big surprise there. But so it's me and Sam here. We did run grading a week ago. Talked about offensive line play, what we look for there. Go back and listen if you haven't done so yet. Today we're going to get into the passing game. What we look for along the offensive line, QBs, DBs, wide receivers, all that good stuff. So, Sam, let's get right into it. Let's get right into it and talk about the quarterbacks. One of our biggest things that we say and repeat ad nauseum in our training process, even in the social sphere, is that we grade the throws and not necessarily the outcome, whereas traditional stats will give you the outcome and not necessarily the throw. Sam, explain to us what that kind of means.
Yeah, so the best example for this, I think, is if anyone can remember back to the Pittsburgh Steelers, Miami Dolphins, was it a wild card game this past postseason? I think on back-to-back throws, Ben Roethlisberger basically went to either extreme of this. On one throw, he threw the ball directly into the arms of a dropping defensive lineman. Should have been intercepted, but it was a nose tackle who had the ball hit his hands. And I think it ricocheted from the nose tackle straight to Antonio Brown, who ended up with like a 12-yard reception on the play. So that is a terrible pass. Should have been an interception. Should have been the lowest grade, or is the lowest grade you could possibly get, because it should have turned the ball straight over. Ends up on the stat sheet in the box score being 1-for-1 for 12 yards or whatever it is. And then I think the very next play, or maybe it worked in the other way around, he threw the ball straight to his receiver, ends up getting dropped and incomplete pass. So it was a really good pass, ends up getting an incompletion, a passer rating of 40 or whatever that is, 39.6. So yeah, a lot of times the quarterback or the result of the throw is exactly what it should be, but there's a lot of plays where it really isn't, and those are two complete extremes, where it's dropped or one that should have been intercepted ends up being a completed pass and that kind of stuff. But there are plays where there's a lot of nuance in between those, and what is a pretty good pass doesn't get rewarded. What's a reasonably bad pass ends up getting away with it completely. The idea of the grading scale is to completely eliminate all of those and to actually take account of what happened, not necessarily what it resulted in.
Yeah, we caught a lot of flack for a few different things in the past. One, the Aaron Rodgers, the 0 grade or the negative 0.8 grade that we gave him against the Chiefs when he threw 5 touchdowns, when it was like he was throwing bubble screens and those slant flat combos all day long and getting a ton of yards after catch and had a couple dropped interceptions, and that's just going to look in our grading system worse than a guy who maybe has a few interceptions that weren't his fault and has a few big drops down the field that could have been touchdowns. That guy might grade well, even though his stats won't reflect it. So, like we said, we try to grade the throw, not the outcome. One of the other things that we caught flack for was giving Carson Palmer in 2015 our MVP. A lot of times those traditional stats, yards, touchdowns, don't take into account who was doing the work. It doesn't take into account what the quarterback had to do to get those yards. That season, 2015, Carson Palmer had more yards through the air. He was putting the ball down the field more than any other quarterback in the NFL, 200 more yards than any other quarterback in the NFL, just purely through the air before the wide receiver did anything after the catch, and had more air yards per attempt than any season we've graded in the past 11 years. That includes Aaron Rodgers, 2011, Tom Brady in 2007. His air yards per attempt was the highest of all those seasons, which is, that doesn't get reflected in the normal box score stats that you see, but like we said, that's why our grading system what it's supposed to do is capture the fact that the quarterback's doing the work, not necessarily the wide receivers or other people.
Yeah, if you dig into some of the more advanced numbers in that Carson Palmer season, some of them are absolutely ridiculous. I know Ben Stockwell ran some stuff in terms of expected accuracy in certain routes and in certain levels of the field. And given, like you said, that Palmer had the highest average depth of target or average air yards of anybody basically since we've been looking, his expected accuracy should have been middle of the pack at best in terms of some of these areas. But it was the best. It was the top figure of anybody in the NFL, which just shouldn't be possible. And that's one of the big reasons why pretty much all the way along we were calling for a big regression from Palmer for the next season, because there's just no way you could sustain that kind of play. But equally, it makes that level of play incredible and worthy of celebrating when the guy actually does it for a season.
Yes, yeah, like his passer rating wasn't anything special, wasn't tops in the league or anything, but what he did to get that was, like we said, crazy. So let's go through the actual scale of the grading system. Sam, talk us through. We broke down how we grade from -2 to +2. What are we looking for? What does each of those mean in our system?
Yeah, so the same scale just applied to quarterbacks. For 0.5 plays, we're looking at simple, effective, moving the chains kind of plays. If you're able to fit a ball in, pick up a first down, nothing spectacular, you're going to get a 0.5.
Slant
Typically,
pitches, simple out routes, stuff like that.
Yeah, and it's got to be the kind of stuff where it's either picking up the entirety of the first down yardage through the air, or it's leading the receiver into the space to make that first down. If it's just a case of, you put the ball 4 yards downfield into open space and that receiver runs for the first down, again, the quarterback's not getting the credit for that because it's a throw we expect every quarterback to make. The receiver's done more work than the quarterback has, so the quarterback's just getting that expected 0 grade. To get a +1, it's got to be a more difficult throw, essentially. It's got to be deeper down the field. It's got to be a smaller window. It's got to be a more impressive throw than just simply a routine slant that's picking up a first down. So the ones I think that are good examples of this are, when you think of that out route from the far hash, 10, 15 yards down the field, it's effectively not picking up that much more yardage, but because you're talking about the far hash, it's a much more difficult throw. Those are the NFL throws that people want to see quarterbacks make at the combine and pro days and that kind of stuff to prove that they've got the physical capabilities of making all these NFL throws. Those are the ones that'll get you a +1, or a post route into pretty tight coverage in the middle of the field, that kind of thing. To get your 1.5s, that's when we're talking big time throws into extremely tight coverage, deep down the field. The throws where you look at it on tape and you just say, wow, that's an incredible play. It's one of those ones where it is pretty self-explanatory. The ones that get 1.5s are pretty spectacular. You think those plays, Aaron Rodgers usually has a couple in a season. You think the Andrew Luck play where he's basically falling down and manages to launch a perfect touchdown to a receiver, that kind of stuff.
I think that got a 2, actually.
I think it did, actually, yeah.
2. And 2s will also be crunch time, 1.5s get 2s. Really, we reserve 2s for incredible feats of, like you said, the Andrew Luck getting tackled as he threw it, Aaron Rodgers getting tackled as he threw it, things like that. The Aaron Rodgers throw to Jared Cook at the end of the game against the Cowboys was a +2, just because ridiculous throw, ridiculous window, crunch time. You just can't get much better than that, basically.
Yeah, and on the negative side, a -0.5 is basically your standard inaccurate throw. So a throw that was there to be made, an open receiver, and you just missed the guy, whether it's over his head, whether it's into the dirt, whether it's behind him, in front of him, routine miss. -1 is when you start getting into that's not just a miss, that's now getting dangerous. You put it in harm's way. You've put it in a defender's reach. You've actually been in danger of getting picked off on that play.
Yeah, like overthrows on posts over the middle of the field, that sort of thing where, yeah, it's not necessarily you didn't misread the play, but where the throw location went was in danger of getting intercepted, even if it's not intercepted. It's
rarer, but we've given out -1s before on basically plays that were so wide open that you should have scored a touchdown by just lofting it over the defense to a busted coverage on a wide receiver. If you miss that guy and cost your team 7 points, that'll get you a -1 as well for the miss. Even though it's effectively just a simple missed throw, it's not in danger. It's cost you 7 points. So
yeah, I remember Matt Ryan had I think just like a speed out on a 4th down once. This was 2 years back that he just blew. Guy wide open, busted coverage, blew a speed out. If you're missing a speed out, which is about a 2-yard, 3-yard throw if you're not hitting a receiver, that can get you a -1 as well.
And then the -1.5s are your typical interception. It's a bad, dangerous throw. It's been punished by a pick. It's, you've misread the coverage. You haven't seen the dropping linebacker underneath the out route you're trying to hit, or.
But again, the interception part doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's picked off or if the throw was a poor decision into coverage. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just making the point that most interceptions fall into that category. It's that's the level of throw you're typically looking at when you're looking at -1.5s. But yeah, like you say, whether it actually results in an interception or not is irrelevant to the grade. You're going to get the big negative whether the defender gets it in his hands or not.
Then -2, all the way to the bottom, is
the Matt Schaub's.
Yes, is basically you did a -1.5 throw, but complete misread, but in a position where that throw's on going back to the house or likely going back the other way for 6. If you're, misreading cover 2 and throw a flat route when the guy's jumping it, that's the sort of throw that is a -2, just a complete misread in a position where it could be taken back for a lot of yardage.
Those are the most common ones. Those sideline throws where you've screwed up the coverage and there's a corner or a guy sitting on that just runs straight, picks off the ball, and he's going nowhere but back into the end zone.
Yep. So I guess that's quarterbacks. It's how we look at them every single throw. The 0, we didn't actually really touch too in depth. 0 is going to be things like screens, safe throwaways, guys that are, putting it into maybe being under pressure, having no real options, and putting it in a safe position, even if you're not necessarily accurate on a wide receiver, but it's away from coverage, and you had really no other choice but to get rid of the ball. Those sort of things will get you 0s, or simple hitches that are 4 or 5 yards on the field with still 10 yards to go. Those are our 0 throws, stuff like that.
Yeah, the other thing that I think me and Steve touched on a while ago is one of the great hidden kind of grading points or hidden statistics for quarterbacks is ball security. So, we don't tend to think of this as part of their job because it doesn't really show up in the box score for passing. But if you've got a quarterback that's just doesn't have a good feel for what's going on in the pocket, is constantly getting the ball knocked out and fumbling, those are critical bad plays. We talked about a lot of them. It's not the quarterback's fault. So if you think of those typical Robert Mathis strip sacks where quarterback's cocked looking to throw the ball down the field, but Mathis comes down and tomahawk chops on that arm and just knocks the ball out. We're not going to blame the quarterback for that. He doesn't know it's coming. It's not on him to feel that guy from having no idea that he's coming. The ones where we're blaming the quarterback are where he clearly knows the pressure's coming. He's kind of got time to see it. He knows that some kind of contact is going, and either he's still trying to make a play anyway, or he just has bad ball security and he ends up coughing it up in contact, turning the ball over. I mean, those are as bad as throwing a bad interception. You're giving the ball to the defense.
Yeah, and to add to that, we will also downgrade quarterbacks for taking sacks that were basically unnecessary to take. If there's, taking a late sack for us, which counts as about after 3.5, around 4 seconds and over. If you're taking a sack as a quarterback after that, if you're still in the pocket and take a sack after that, that's on you. You're getting a downgrade for that. You're getting charged for the sack because you need to get rid of the ball in the NFL. An offensive line can only be expected to hold up for so long. Also, if you're scrambling around with no pressure, run into a sack, things like that, we'll downgrade quarterbacks for when a lot of times people see sacks as an offensive line stat. We'll try to assign blame for those as well and downgrade. Now, if it's a third down and a guy's trying to make a play with his legs, yeah, we'll be lenient. We won't downgrade him because, the only other option is to punt. But if it's a first or second and the guy's running into pressure, recklessly, that's the Tyrod Taylor, the Colin Kaepernick, they get dinged for a lot. But we'll charge those guys for the sacks and we'll downgrade accordingly.
Or the ones that drive me nuts where the quarterback
ends
RG3,
up actually, the walking
scrambling
backwards.
Out of the pocket. Yeah, well, scrambling out of the pocket, running to the sideline, and instead of just throwing the ball away, we'll run out 3 yards behind the line of scrimmage and get a sack, lose yardage.
Yeah, you're getting downgraded for that. Your awareness is going to get you a downgrade. So I think that covers quarterbacks, though.
Yeah.
That's all the way through quarterbacks. All right, so hit quarterbacks. Let's talk a little bit about, we kind of just touched on, charging sacks. Let's talk about pass pro, pass rush grading. I actually had to come up with, so we graded the Senior Bowl here, and we graded the one-on-ones. I came up with a clear definition that we use for our, what's a 0, what's a plus 0.5, what's a 1, what's a 1.5. And in our pass protection grading, it is for offensive linemen in pass protection, 0 is the expected. So they can only get negatives. You can only go downwards. You basically gain your positive grade, or your grade goes upwards by the normalization factor that we have. And those change based on how many guys are in protection, how many guys if guys came on a blitz, where the slide was, double teams, that sort of thing will get normalized. So if you had a harder job on the play, if you're a left tackle and the slide was away from you and you're one-on-one with a pass rusher, you're going to get a higher normalization factor. And the quarterback had a deep drop, held it for a long time. Your grade's going to go up more than if you're a center and you were sliding left and there was only one guy coming on that side and you didn't block anyone. You might get a tiny normalization factor up and get a bump up in your grade, whereas the left tackle gets a much larger bump up for doing his job, or for having a much harder job and executing it better. So that's how sort of offensive line works. And then just in pass rushing, it's usually a purely adversarial in terms of, if a left tackle gets a minus 1.5, the guy who beat him usually gets a 1.5. Now, there are times where that's not the case. Basically, someone like Eric Flowers not getting out of his stance and, a guy just running around him to the edge, that's going to be Eric Flowers getting a minus 1.5. The guy across from not quite getting that high of a grade, not getting a 1.5 because just running in a straight line, not going to get you as much, not going to get you, not nearly as impressive as actually beating someone. So what we came up with was a plus 1.5 for us is a clean win on contact. Think of anyone against TJ Clemmings last year. When
that's cold.
You just hit, when a defender hits and the offensive lineman never gains control. Spin moves are usually a lot of times 1.5s because if you just cleanly get them on the hit, if you're free to the quarterback, that's a 1.5. And then obviously conversely, a minus 1.5 for the offensive lineman. A plus 1 for us is a win win through contact, getting the whole body to the quarterback, or clean win on a secondary sort of move, or an immediate bull rush where you're walking an offensive lineman all the way through the quarterback spot. If any of that makes sense to you. I think that was pretty self-explanatory. 0.5 is a normal bull rush that gets the offensive lineman to the quarterback's drop spot. A win through contact on a sort of secondary move, or getting a free hand to the quarterback's drop spot off, when you try to rip on the edge, you get one hand that can get to the quarterback. That is a 0.5 as well. Or just any sack off of pursuit or unblocked sack will get you a 0.5. And zeros are not winning, basically. Not winning, or if you win very late, 4 seconds, that's still going to get you a 0. In our book, beating double teams it falls in there somewhere. It gets you a little higher grade than the normal, than that normal 0.5 to 1.5 scale that we had there. Beating double teams will bump you up a notch. Other things that come in, I'm trying to think.
You get a boost for, if you're able to do the strip sack, the forced fumble stuff.
And strip sacks. Yes, again, you get a boost for that as well. So that's how the pass rush grading works. That's the scale we use. And if it results in a sack, if it results in a hit, if it results in a pressure, if it doesn't affect the quarterback at all, we don't change the scale of the grading. It is what you did versus your assignment against the offensive lineman you were going against, or the multiple offensive lineman you were going against, what you did in your job, not necessarily how it affected the quarterback or affected the play, because you can really only control that. A lot of times balls get out super quickly. A 2-second throw, there's almost never going to be a sack on that. It's just hard to get to the quarterback in time that quickly. So sacks we've seen are incredibly random, so we don't really reward them any more than than any regular pressure or just beating an offensive lineman in general. So unless, like I said, you're unblocked and you actually go and clean it up. So that's
so there's some interesting stuff in there, because obviously the kind of the most crude way of just measuring a pass rusher is how many sacks did he have? You know, if he had 5 sacks, it was a pretty crappy season. If he had 15, it was a great season. And kind of the first layer that we add to that is, yeah, but you know, sacks are like 1% of a guy's pass rush. What about all the pressure he racks up in addition to those sacks? And I think that's a big extra dimension because you're just looking at more plays. So maybe those two guys got 5 sacks versus 15, but maybe the guy with 5 sacks had 50 more pressures over the season than the guy with 15. So at that point, well, that suddenly becomes a much more complex picture. Now, I'm not saying which one had the better season there. If you value sacks dramatically more than you value pressure, then fair enough. There's still the argument that the guy with 10 more had a more impressive season. But the other layer that we started picking at there with the grading is even each one of those 3 categories, sacks, hits, and hurries, there's different layers within those. So you can have a sack that took 4 seconds or was a clean-up sack and a guy just ended up wandering into the pass rusher and he just cleaned it up. Or you can have a sack that beat a guy instantly on contact, you know, that Dwight Freeney spin move that just kills the guy inside, sack after 2 seconds, that kind of thing. But equally, that applies to pressure and to hits as well. So then you start getting the question of what's a better pass rushing play, the guy that gets an instant clean win on contact with his blocker, with the left tackle, but the ball ends up getting out anyway, or it's even the contact dislodges the ball, but it's the arm was coming forward, so it's an incomplete pass. You know, that can be a hit after 2 seconds, instant win, destroys the quarterback, but the ball came forward, so it's incomplete. It's not a sack. Versus a cleanup sack or a pursuit sack or one that took 4.5 seconds to develop and you just slowly worked your way to the quarterback. You know, I think there's a pretty good argument, almost inarguable, that the first one is a better play. The second one may be a better result for the defense, but the first one is the better play and deserves a better grade. So, you know, when you start picking at these and you start thinking, well, why are these guys getting really good pass rushing grades at PFF, but the numbers don't always support it? And by that, I mean not just the sack numbers, you know, the guy with 10, 15 sacks, but sometimes the pressure numbers don't necessarily support it either, because you're not necessarily getting a huge volume of them, but the ones you get are really quick, or maybe you've got a really high amount of pressure given the amount of pass rushing snaps you've had on the field. So in terms of pressure rate, you're much better than a lot of other guys. So there's a lot of kind of nuanced layers to this that go beyond simply how many sacks did you have over a season.
Yeah, and the ultimate goal and why we do this, why, like I said, we're not rewarding, while a sack is a better play for a result, like Sam said, it's not the better play. We're trying to boil this down to individual performance, what is predictive over time, and we found that that is more predictive, you know, than just looking at sacks, looking at the fact that, you know, someone like Eric Walden had double-digit sacks last year. That doesn't mean he was any better player than he was at any point in time. He just got luckier, basically. When the 10-sack season is only 2% of your pass rushes for the season, when most full-time starters are rushing the passer 500 times, that's 2% of your snaps. That's not a sample that's not a indicative sample size over the course of a season to predict in the future. That's why just taking into pressures account, taking in just blocks that they won that didn't necessarily result in pressure, taking in hits, all those other things gives you a much more predictive, gives you a much bigger sample size, and we think is much more indicative of who is impacting more plays on the field.
And it wouldn't be a good sample size even if all of those sacks were clean wins, as opposed to unblocked or busts in the protection or pursuit or any of those things you kind of expect the guy to achieve. Even if you were talking just about legitimate sacks, it wouldn't be a good sample size. If you look at a guy like Khalil Mack had 11 sacks last year, but he had 96 total pressures. So you're almost increasing by a factor of 10 the sample size you're looking at just by looking at all pressures instead of just sacks.
That's pass rush, pass pro. That is how we do that. And then let's get into coverages, Sam. So
this is where it gets fun.
So wide receivers versus DBs, tight ends versus linebackers, running backs, grading. how do we begin to even talk about coverages? What do you do when you're training people, Sam?
Well, I think you have to understand coverages, not just what happens when the ball goes in the air, but you have to know the basic structures of coverages the defense are going to use that you're going to see on a given play, because obviously that changes what responsibilities are, what the grades are, depending on what a guy should be doing on the play. So, guys running man coverage obviously are doing completely different things to guys running zone coverage. So if you don't understand that, you're not going to be able to do anything. But equally within each one of those giant buckets, you've got various different types of man coverage. You've got various different types of zone coverage. And, the first job, I think, on more or less any given pass play or any given target is to take a look at the defense and ask yourself, what were they running on that play?
Yes. If you don't look in our grading every single play, every time there's a pass play, the first thing I do is try to see what coverage they were in, because if you don't know what coverage they're in, you just cannot properly evaluate what each guy was trying to do there. You have to know these shell coverages. This is the thing that I'd say catch a lot of flack for, maybe the most flack for, is the old, you don't know the play call. We don't know. A lot of people say you don't know the coverage that was called. You don't know what they were supposed to be doing. And there are obviously times where that's true. There are times where there's busts and we don't know who messed up. And when that's the case, we give everyone 0 grades because we're not going to guess at who did mess up. But it really boils down to the coverages in the NFL. There are only a handful of coverages. Like we mentioned with run concepts, there are only a handful of things, and you can usually tell by the way everyone's playing it if one guy messes up playing a completely different technique or a different style than everyone else. Usually multiple people aren't busting on the same play. So want to walk people through the shell coverages that you look for, Sam, on a play-by-play basis?
Yeah, and I think the other point I would make with that is, we were always doing this mentally the way we're about to talk, just kind of asking yourself what the coverage was, figuring it out through looking at the play and then grading accordingly. For the past few years, as part of our data collection stuff for NFL teams, we've been recording these coverages for every given play and, not just taking them down kind of mentally for the purpose of grading, but actually logging every single play. This is cover 0, this is cover 3, and having that in our database to send to NFL teams. And we haven't had a whole series of guys come back and say, well, this is just inaccurate crap. I mean, we've been pretty accurate on this stuff. Obviously there's a margin of error in all of this, but the NFL teams are satisfied with the accuracy that we've been doing this in. So for all the margin of error that is inherent in all of this stuff, you can pretty accurately record the coverage on more or less every single play if you have the time to go through and look at the tape and kind of break it down and, run it slowly. And like you say, work sometimes player to player and individually figure out what everybody is doing and kind of build a picture up that way. It's one of those things that sounds very difficult and completely impossible when you kind of just speculate it out. But when you actually start working through it practically, it is doable. Like you say, there's going to be some plays that you've got no shot on, and that's just the way it goes. But the vast majority of plays, you're fine.
Yeah, we don't know. We are not in the room knowing the actual play call, what it's called in their playbook. The whole and every single coaching point, but you don't really need to. A lot of that, shows itself on the field with how the guy attempts to play it and that sort of stuff. So, and if a guy messes up his, technique and whatnot on the play, it shows by him being in bad coverage. And if he does mess up his technique on the play and it doesn't result in him being in bad coverage, well then, hey, good luck to him. He got lucky that time, but we're not going to downgrade him for it. So that's the gist of what we look for.
Yeah, so I would say the first thing is the biggest bucket you can separate these things into, which is man or zone coverage. And man coverage is what it sounds like. Every single defensive back or every single defender in coverage has a man that they're assigned to, and their job is to follow that guy for as long as the play runs and make sure he doesn't catch the football. Simple enough. There's a few different types of man coverage, and they differentiate themselves by essentially how many free deep defenders over the top. So you're either cover 0 is There's no deep defender over the top. There's no safety valve. There's no safety, effectively, over the top of this defense. Every single person has a man, and there's nothing else going on. So if one of those guys gets beat, it's a touchdown, basically, because there's nobody behind him. Typically, everyone else in a cover zero is rushing the passer, and the idea really is to get pressure before it becomes a problem, before somebody gets beat. Then you got cover one, which is basically the exact same thing, except there is one deep free safety. There is the emergency safety valve over the top, and if some guy gets beat, that guy, in theory, is able to prevent the touchdown. And that's basically his only role in that play. And then the other one is two-man, which is man coverage, but you've got two deep safeties. So effectively, like a cover two look, but everyone underneath is playing man instead of zone coverage. And that's a little more, it's a little easier for those guys to actually influence the play and not just prevent touchdowns, but to actually legitimately help out.
Yeah, so the single biggest giveaway of man coverage is the eyes of defensive backs, linebackers, that sort of thing. If you're in man coverage, you will not be looking anywhere else but the man you're guarding after the snap of the ball.
Shouldn't be.
That's just, that's just what it is, because you want to know where he's going, not anybody else. If you have any sort of zone responsibilities or pass off responsibilities, you're going to be looking elsewhere because you have to know if someone else is coming. You can't put your sole focus on that guy in front of you. So that is the single biggest differentiator between man coverage if you're just watching on TV. Look at the eyes of the defenders. If they are not looking away from their man, if they are on him all day, that means they're in man coverage. That's a dead giveaway of man coverage.
Yeah, I mean, the other way is that, I mean, it's the same thing really, but another way of saying it is that people in zone coverage will virtually never turn their back to the quarterback. So anytime the defensive back turns all the way around, he's not facing the quarterback, he's going to be in man coverage because he's working to the receiver. He's not got his eyes on the quarterback looking for the ball. He's just playing the guy that's assigned to his coverage. He's playing his man. And
that's especially evident in two-man, where almost always you're going to be playing trail technique underneath, where you let, as a DB, you let the guy get a step on you because you know you have total help over the top. You have two safeties on either side. They're not worried about getting beaten deep. You're just worried about mirroring any sort of route.
Yeah, and that's what we talked about, those two safeties. Those guys are not just kind of ornamental safety valves anymore. They're actively involved in this coverage, so the guys underneath can not get beat, but they can allow themselves a little bit more space behind a receiver that they couldn't do if it was just cover one. Because if you lose a step and cover one down the sideline, the chance of that single high free safety getting all the way to the sideline to make any kind of impact on that play is pretty minimal. Whereas in cover two, he's there able to get to that sideline and to make sure that's shut down.
Correct. All right. So that's man coverage. That is what we look for. Man coverage is very easy in our grading system because you have a man. It's not, there's no passing off. There's no holes in zone to have to worry about to say, whose was that? Was it supposed to be this guy, that guy? You have a man in front of you. If you screw up your coverage, we can see it. And that's how we grade it. So that's man coverage. That's the easy part. Let's kick off zone coverage then. Our buckets are cover 3, cover 4, cover 6, and cover 2. Sam, walk us through them.
So again, the number is essentially referring to the number of deep zones. So cover 2, you've got those 2 deep safeties over the top. Cover 3, you have 3 deep coverage defenders, but 2 of them are the cornerbacks. So it's not 3 safeties. Yeah, usually it's not 3 safeties. It's the single high free safety and 2 corners that are dropping deep to split the field into thirds. And then the underneath coverage where the corners used to be is getting picked up by linebackers and that kind of thing in the flats. Cover 4, same deal. You're dividing the field into quarters, also what it's known as. Again, 2 of the deep zones are cornerbacks, 2 of the deep zones are safeties. And then cover 6 is the only one that doesn't actually follow that trend, because what you're doing there is essentially splitting the field in half and playing a combination coverage. So on one side, it is effectively cover 2, where you have 1 deep safety in the corner in the flat. And the other side, you're playing quarters or cover 4. So that's where it's come from. 2 plus 4 is 6. And on the other side, I believe so. I wasn't great at math, but I think that's how it works. I know Nathan's been teaching me, and that's how I got to that. But yeah, so that on that side, you've got the deep corner and the deep free safety, and they split that side of the field in half effectively. So cover 2 is probably the easiest one to start with. 2 deep safeties over the top. The wrinkle in this one is that Tampa 2 look that you get, where in order to really help those 2 safeties over the top impact the sideline plays, teams drop a middle linebacker to almost become a third deep zone in the middle of the field. His job is to basically get as much depth as humanly possible, split those 2 safeties, allow them to cheat towards the sideline and really help on everything else. The flats are taken by the corners, and then everyone else, the linebacker drops, are in that kind of middle zone underneath.
You almost never see normal cover 2 anymore. It's all Tampa 2 in the NFL. I mean, Tampa 2 is not even that, it's not that played that often. It's usually a third and long type of coverage that people play to try to be safe, and put a cap on the defense. But if you're just playing pure cover 2, there are some gaping holes down the field because you only have 2 guys to cover, 53 1/3 yards there. It's a lot of space for 2 guys. So that's why you drop the linebacker as far as possible there.
Not only is it a lot of space, but it's an almost impossible angle to cover, because the way you're vulnerable if you're those deep safeties is a post route, essentially. It's a receiver running vertical, already at full speed, and at a given point, he is just going to break into the middle of the field, already running at full speed. And it's only at the point he makes that break that you can even start to move. You're pedaling basically to get depth.
Yeah,
but you can't. Yeah, but you can't break on that route until he cuts in, at which point he's moving full speed. You're basically backpedaling and have to turn, flip, and try and run with him. And you just can't make the play. I mean, it's virtually impossible for that safety to ever be in lockstep with that receiver. And that's the play that coverage gets gashed on. So consequently, teams drop that middle linebacker to try and at least squeeze the window on that throw and take away the middle of the field. And those safeties can concentrate a little bit more on the sideline.
And you'll often hear about cover 2 or zone corners getting a bad rap, cover 2 especially, because you don't have deep responsibility as a cornerback in cover 2. You turn into, a glorified linebacker in the zone that you have to cover as a cornerback in cover 2. And that's why a lot of teams that have bad cornerbacks, a lot of teams that don't have, guys who they think can play man coverage, will play a lot of cover 2 to some degree protect those cornerbacks and not give them as much responsibility. I know the Eagles last year were one of the teams that played a good deal of that because of you just don't have the corners to play, to give them deep responsibilities. You're just too worried about them. The Packers as well did a lot of that last year. So if you don't have good cornerbacks, you'll probably play more cover 2 solely because it puts more stress on your linebackers and safeties to make plays in coverage.
Yeah, and then the interesting kind of flip side to that is that if you're playing a lot of cover 2, those guys are playing the flats. Those guys need to be good tacklers. They need to be good run defenders because they got their eyes on the quarterback. Everything, or well, not everything, but most of the plays they have to deal with are within those first 5 yards. They've got to get physical quickly. So you think of a guy like Charles Tillman, as your perfect cover 2 corner because he has that physicality and that ability to get up there and make plays in the run game and against short stuff quickly. And that's the kind of the different dimension the cover 2 corners have that man cover corners don't necessarily.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. They're like glorified linebackers in the zones that they have.
Yeah. So the next one would be cover 3, where
the most
your
popular
2 corners
in the NFL at the moment.
Yeah,
by far.
Where your two corners are the deep zones. So the wrinkle in this, and the wrinkle with a few of these coverages, is there's basically ways of combining man and zone within the same coverage shell. So the best example of this is the Seahawks. If you look at what they do with Richard Sherman, everyone thinks of the Seahawks as just a cover 3 team. And when you start debating cornerbacks, a lot of people just dismiss Richard Sherman because, he only plays in a cover 3. Yeah, zone corner only plays in a cover 3. As if, incidentally, that's an easy thing to do, even if he was just playing cover 3 zone corner. But unlike the cover 2 that we talked about, where you can kind of hide a lot of coverage deficiencies in your cornerbacks by playing that because you take away their deep responsibility, by definition, the cover 3 guy is defending a deep third of the field. I mean, he has to run vertically with receivers. He has to cover deep stuff. He's got to do a lot in coverage that those cover 2 guys don't. So it's not like it's an easy gig to begin with, but you see the Seahawks do it a lot where they will have cover 3 across the board, but they will lock Richard Sherman up one-on-one with his guy and basically have him play bail technique, but it's effectively man coverage on that side of the field. And the other teams have done this as well, but the Seahawks, I think, do the most of it at the moment. And you kind of blur the lines between the zone and man concepts. But effectively, again, you've got a single high free safety, but because the field is now divided into thirds, he doesn't have to make it sideline to sideline. He can be more active over the middle of the field. Those 2 cornerbacks are playing a deep third themselves. They have to cover everything deep. And this time there should be an underneath flat defender, so they don't have to worry about comebacks, really short stuff to the flats, the kind of swing passes out, the kind of stuff that you typically expect those cover 2 corners to take, the kind of flare routes coming into the flat, the speed outs, all that kind of stuff. Shouldn't be the responsibility of a cover 3 corner. It should be the guy in the flat taking care of that.
Cover 3 is also where you'll get a lot of hybrid sort of coverages where you'll have man coverage on one side, zone on the other, in terms of guys like Rich Sherman will just man up on his wide receiver and everyone else will sort of still be in cover 3. You'll get things where you'll get a lot of zone blitzes will be cover 3, fire zone, the most popular, zone blitzes, 3 deep, 3 under, cover 3, but it removes one of the underneath defenders on a blitz, so that's cover 3 as well. And what was the last thing that I was trying to get at here? I can't remember. There was one more point I was trying to make, but cover 3, like I said, the most popular coverage in the NFL at the moment.
Yeah, and then so the one that always gets me with cover 3 is the one that we get every single week in our review calls is the deep crossing route against cover 3. It's the thing that always kills this coverage. And if you manage to pull it off, it's virtually unstoppable because we've been doing this for, a few years now in terms of the weekly review call and all this kind of stuff. And you could definitely count on one hand the number of times I've seen a linebacker successfully cover that deep crossing route. So, the idea is it's a long developing play, typically play action. One receiver will work a deep cross in behind the linebackers, but in front of those deep 3 guys who are typically being run off by deep patterns. And a huge gap opens up between those 3 and the linebackers underneath them who are just trying to drop and get depth to squeeze this window. But if the quarterback has enough time, that route works its way all the way across the field and just finds space between those 2. And technically speaking, it's on one of the linebackers, but you almost don't expect them to ever make it because they don't.
Yes, that every week pisses me off. That when people say you don't, responsibilities, that's probably the one where it always varies by team because you'll have certain teams will have when they drop the safety down in cover 3 because 2 safeties, one will be the deep middle safety, one will come down into the box and be one of the the underneath hook defenders there. Sometimes it's that guy's responsibility to just run with any sort of seam stuff, but some teams will just play it where it's the linebackers have to get dropped under it. So that one always upsets me, I'll say, on Tuesdays.
Yeah, it's always a fun one. And then you got cover 4 or quarters. So 2 deep safeties, but they're very narrow. So the big differentiator, or one of the big differentiators, is these guys are not trying to get width when you see them immediately after the snap. You look at safeties trying to get to their landmarks of where they're supposed to be on the play. When you look at a cover 2 or Tampa 2, those guys immediately are getting width towards the numbers, getting away from the middle of the field. Cover 4 guys aren't. They're staying narrow because they've got 2 corners outside them, one on either side, who are taking essentially a deep quarter as well. Where this gets complicated again is there's a lot of kind of man concepts within cover 4 in terms of assignments, in terms of responsibilities, and how exactly what is a zone coverage matches up with various route combinations.
Yes, the cover 4 has will blow a lot of coverage as well in terms of passing off when you get to, passing off between the corner and the safety on their respective sides, because a lot of teams will have, declaration points where if a wide receiver gets to this point in his route, he turns into the safety's man. If he turns to this point in his route, he's the cornerback's man. And sometimes, people have the safety and the corner have different opinions on how far they got in that route, and they'll, go to the wrong guy. So cover 4 gets a little hairy as well when you talk about responsibilities.
Yeah, but again, if you look at on a kind of drawn up on the chalkboard on a field, you've effectively got 4 deep zones, and then underneath coverage is supposed to take care of the rest. So you've got flat defender on either side and a guy in the middle, and that's your cover 4. Cover 6, like I said, that's a split coverage where you've got half the field is cover 4, the other half is cover 2, and they basically split the coverage that way. Usually, I mean, it's organized by the offensive formation, so that's typically how you're going to see it deployed, and reasonably speaking, the same rules apply to kind of each side of the field.
Yes, and a lot of times, this is what I was trying to get at with cover 3 and cover 6. When you hear about guys having, guys getting game plan for, wide receivers like Odell Beckham, Calvin Johnson, Julio Jones getting game plan for, a lot of times they'll run cover 6 and cover 3. Cover 6 being they'll put a guy in man coverage on wide receiver like Julio Jones and on the cover 2 side of a coverage like cover 6. So there's a safety over the top. That's what you talk about when I say safety over the top. You'll be in man coverage. That underneath guy will be in man coverage with the safety over the top in cover 6. Everyone else, is still playing, sort of their zones covering everyone else. But if you have Julio Jones on the left side, you have a corner on him, and then he knows he has a safety help over the top and help in the middle in terms of zone coverage. So that is cover 6, and then in cover 3 as well, if you can sometimes stick like a slot guy or, one of the underneath defenders in cover 3, the guy who's responsible for the flat, you can stick him in man coverage on a number 1 receiver. And then that cover 3 corner who would have maybe had some sort of underneath responsibility just backs out right away to get depth so that you're not getting beat deep over the top. That's when you hear someone say safety over the top, that's what those, usually a lot of times it's those 2 coverages.
And that's why the idea of receivers getting double teamed gets very kind of difficult to define, because something like that is essentially a double team. That kind of, those special rules for Julio Jones or Des Bryant where you're running cover 6 effectively to be able to free up help over the top for one of those guys. But at the same time, it's just cover 6. So if you want to define that as double team, it's not wrong. It's a specific game plan to try and put 2 guys on that guy, but it's not like the only thing those guys are doing is looking for number 11 the whole time.
Yes,
they're actually
pure
running
double
a
teams.
specific coverage.
Extremely rare, often only on third downs, red zone type of plays, and not even every team defensively will run them. I know a lot of teams. I feel like the Patriots will run a good deal of them. That's probably the only team I've seen run them fairly consistently.
And then you get the ridiculous, legitimate kind of vice type alignment where you get 2 guys jamming a guy on the line of scrimmage for your pure legitimate double team. Almost never happens, but you do see it.
All right, so I think that's a good overview of coverages in general, what we're looking for, what to look for to identify each. And now let's get into actually then how they get graded, what the scale looks like when we are grading the passing play, Sam.
Well, the reason that's important is because the offenses only have a certain number of plays, and they're going to run those plays regardless of what the coverage looks like. And you need to know, once that play is run, once this route is targeted, where is everybody supposed to be on that play, given what they're looking at? So, if you just think of a typical slant route, against cover 2, it's simple. The corner on that side has got the flat, so he's got that slant receiver. That's his man immediately. They're typically, when you're playing cover 2 in the NFL, you're effectively playing like man within the first couple of yards anyway. So if your guy just runs a slant immediately off the line, you've basically got that guy in man coverage, even if it's a zone scheme. As soon as you see him break, you're driving on that slant and you're trying to break it up. If you are running cover 3, your job is typically to bail at the snap, and you have the deep coverage, and there's supposed to be a guy buzzing out underneath it. So you don't expect that zone corner dropping off to make any kind of play on that slant. It's somebody else's zone effectively. So it completely changes not only how you're going to grade it, but who is even in primary coverage on exactly the same pass pattern.
Yes, and just to get into a little bit of the scale there, slants, it's very similar for wide receivers to what we grade for cornerbacks. Basically, if you're getting an underneath play that goes for slants that go for first downs, hitches, that sort of thing, those are 0.5s. Get a little deeper, you run an effective post pattern, you run a nice a nice double move, something like that gets you about 20 yards or so. You're getting into a +1. You get a lot of separation on a guy far down the field on a go route. You get 5 or so yards separation. That's going to be a 1.5. You make a spectacular one-handed catch like Odell Beckham, you could get even higher to, a +2.5, something like that. So
it's effectively a combination of how big was the play and how bad did you beat the guy or did you get beat? It's a kind of mix of those two things. So, you can get, again, not the result net doesn't necessarily tie in with the grade. Say, if you're in man coverage and you get killed on the snap and you fall over face first in the ground, if that receiver, catches the slant for 5 yards and then falls over and ends up as a 7-yard gain, the DB is still going to get downgraded as if that was, a 70-yard untouched touchdown because he was completely beat at the snap. He had no part in preventing that being a huge play. He deserves the full downgrade. And similarly, there are plays where a DB won't necessarily get killed if he's in really tight coverage and it's just a perfect ball that gets in, even if it's deep down the field. You've got plays where you see the old adage that a perfect throw beats perfect coverage almost every single time. You'll see plays like that where you're looking at it and you say, I don't know what else that corner could have done on that play, but the ball somehow still got in there. So typically usually they'll still get a slight downgrade, a -0.5 for those plays because he did allow the reception, but he's not going to get killed for it because it was good coverage. Whereas a guy 2 yards behind desperately running to catch up is obviously a much worse beat for the same outcome, effectively.
Mm-hmm. Trying to think and then for wide receivers as well, is very similar to running back grading in after the catch ability in terms of if you do something tangible, if you make a nice cut, if you break a tackle, you get a +0.5 add-on for every single thing that you do that tangibly affects the play.
Yeah, wide receivers are generally they're kind of adversarial against the defensive back, but with the addition, like you said, of after the catch stuff, but also the stuff you did to make the catch. So, if the ball is off target and you've had to do something beyond just catch it, you've had to actually make a pretty tough catch, or like you say, the old Odell Beckham, if you've had to do something spectacular just to bring that ball in, that's going to boost the grade up as well, in addition to what you would have got just from the magnitude of the play.
I think that's about it. Did we cover it all, Sam, in terms of passing grading? Is there anything else you want to touch?
No, I think that's pretty much the spectrum. We did QBs, we did pass protection and pass rush, we did coverage. We're good, I think.
All right, there you have it. This is a good lead-in because next week we'll be doing our review on the Early Week podcast of our coverage rankings. Who are the best coverage defenses in the NFL in terms of our grading? We'll be getting to that early next week. And then on the late week next week, Sam, what are we covering in terms of the grading scale? Are we still on that?
I think we're still in the grading scale. I don't think we've decided what we're actually covering yet, though. We'll work it out between now and then.
Yeah, you guys we'll surprise you guys. So tune in next week. We'll be back then. Hope you guys have a good one.